Okay, so welcome to this lecture on supply side policies. And so before we start, I'm going to share something with you, which is related to how supply side policies got underway and how they started. So I will just so this is a very important moment in the development of modern economics. And the person we are looking at here is Ronald Reagan, who became the president of the United States in January 1981. And the first speech then that he gives sets the tone for a new way of economic thinking. And this is what he has to say.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people.
That was the central idea that won Reagan the presidency, a warning he had sounded consistently for years. You can hear it here in the speech that launched his political career.
This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
This was Ronald Reagan's debut as the great communicator, the nationally televised speech for Barry Goldwater that put him on the political map back in 1964.
So this is like a new movement, a new way of thinking in economics, and this then sets the stage. He says something something which is very important, and he is here saying that two things. He says government is not the solution, government is the problem, and the government tries to manage our lives for us, which is wrong. And the lives that he's talking about then is um, economic life. Okay, so what is he saying here? He knows about aggregate demand, and he knows about the fact that when we talk about demand side economics, we talk about moving aggregate demand curve outward in order to bring about an increase in the GDP. But now he says that, look, um, demand side is all very good, but there is another way of improving the situation in the market and improving the output and GDP. And he says that we can do that by moving the supply curve. And when he talks about government being the problem, what he means is that government regulation and government interference in the markets hinders the outward movement of the supply curve. And now we are going to see how and what's the rationale behind that thinking. Okay, so let's today start with supply side policy. So what is supply side policy? So supply side policy, the main thinker in supply side economics um, is Arthur Laffer. Okay, this is more like a very ideology driven politics. So the economics. So the person here is the economist called Arthur Laffer, and he comes up with what is called the Laffer curve. Okay, so let me show you the Laffer curve. This is the Laffer curve, and the Laffer curve says that when the government imposes a tax, the idea is to increase the revenue of the government. So that's the main idea. Okay, um, but then he says that look, when you keep increasing the tax rate, okay, when you keep increasing the tax rate, you are taxing at 5%, you are taxing at 10%, you are taxing at 15%. So your revenue will continue to increase. So look at the Laffer curve now. As you increase the tax rate, what happens is that up to a certain point, your tax revenue, the revenue of the government, keeps increasing. So if the government imposes tax and keeps imposing higher and higher rates of taxes up to a certain point, and please keep in mind those words that he says the government is the problem. The government is the problem. Why? Because one, it regulates the markets too much. The second is that it keeps putting the tax up to a point where instead of the revenue increasing, the revenue of the government actually begins to fall. Because beyond a certain point, if you impose very, very heavy taxes, what's going to happen? It's going to become a disincentive. What happens when tax increases? What happens to supply? Bring that back to mind. When you increase the tax, okay, when you increase the tax at every uh, price level, now the cost of the producer will rise. And what are the factors affecting supply? All factors related to cost. So if the cost of the producer rises, the supply will, instead of increasing, the supply will begin to fall. The supply curve will shift backward. If the aggregate supply curve shifts backward, what happens? Your GDP will decrease. On the one hand, your GDP will decrease, and on the other hand, what's going to happen? Your prices in the market will rise. So it's something like cost push inflation, where cost is going up, and because of the increase in cost, your supply is falling. So that gives rise, to this new way of thinking, which became known as supply side policies. And then what happens in supply side policies? Uh, why do shifts take place in the aggregate supply curve? Okay. Um, so when aggregate supply curve shifts outward, what happens? There is more GDP. There's more. There are more jobs. There's more revenue. All right, for the government. But the good thing here is that when supply goes up, output increases. But unlike the increase in aggregate demand, there is no inflation. Inflation actually goes down. Okay. And when the output increases, that means more revenue for the government. If there are more revenues for the government, it means the government doesn't go into deficit. Okay. But the main and essential thing here is, we are going to look at it in detail, but the main thing here is, how do you achieve what does Reaganomics say? Because the man is Reagan. His economics was called Reaganomics. So why how can you achieve this increase in supply? You can achieve the increase in aggregate supply by ensuring that the government's role is small and that individual freedom is encouraged. And I think here Reagan makes a lot of sense. Like, if you look at most of the things that are happening in the market, they are happening because there is competition in the market, output is being produced, and the level of ingenuity that comes when individual freedom is encouraged is just amazing. Look at the number of channels that just exist on YouTube. These channels were not created by the company; these were created by individuals. So there is a very high level of bias against government interference, though in certain areas government intervention is also encouraged. Okay, so we will see how that happens. uh, Supply side economics tries to kill stagflation. Okay, so stagflation is a situation where the supply remains low, inflation remains high. Usually it's the outcome of cost push inflation. Okay, and cost of production has to be low. So it's all about keeping the cost of production as low as possible. There are 5 cardinal rules in supply side economics. You want to increase the supply, there are some rules. What are the rules? Number 1, indirect taxation should be low. Okay, The tax on individuals should be low. Why should the tax be low? The tax should be low because if you place more tax on individuals, they will have less money to spend on goods and services. Okay, uh, so that throws the economy into a downward spiral. If you do not have money to spend on goods and services, what happens? You're going to demand less goods and services. When you're going to demand less goods and services, in order to keep the economy in balance, what's going to happen? The businesses are going to produce less goods and services. When the businesses produce less goods and services, they will require less people and unemployment will start to rise. And when this happens, the overall GDP of the country falls and the economy goes into a downward spiral. So you have to be very, very careful with tax. As I showed you in the Laffer curve, the government cannot keep increasing tax incessantly. Tax calculations are some of the most complicated and some of the most difficult in the world to implement. And they always have been throughout history. Why? Because you just have to strike the balance, the right amount of tax, the right rate of tax, the right distribution of tax, which you will see when we do the rules of taxation, the cardinal rules of taxation. So now also, if you work, think about it. You keep working, you do a job, and then when you earn the money, the government comes and takes a big chunk away from you. So that reduces the incentive to work. Higher taxations will reduce the incentive to work because you are not enjoying the rewards of your hard work. The government is. Okay, so that's the first thing. You reduce the tax on individuals. The second thing is you reduce the tax on business. All right, so it makes absolute sense. Businesses will only see, money is the greatest coward in the world. It will never go wherever it senses the slightest danger. So business people are in business to maximize their profits. They want return on for the hard work that they are putting in. So businesses will be set up only in those countries where tax rates are optimum. Let's not call it minimum, but where there are optimum. Now, obviously, if you go to countries like, if you go to a state like Florida, Florida is a state where tax rates are not very high. Okay, they've always, it's always been known to have low tax rates. But look at the places where investment is the highest. It's little islands, then they are so rich. Why are they so rich? Because tax on businesses is very, very low. All right. Now, the third point, if you look at the third point, it's related to deregulation, but this is where I will add a caveat, and there are certain, look at the objective of the government. The objective of the government here is to increase supply. So the government is not going to deregulate as a rule. The rule will always remain increasing supply. Now there are certain markets in which there are firms which are monopolies and oligopolies. So what is a monopoly? A monopoly is one large firm controlling the entire market. So let's say in Karachi you have K Electric, Karachi Electricity. So they are a monopoly. Okay. Or you can have an oligopoly. What is an oligopoly? Oligopoly is a situation in which there are a few firms controlling the larger market. So you have Pakistan State Oil, and you have Shell, and you have Caltex. These are the only three companies. There are others, but they are very small. So these are the three companies which supply petroleum products in the country. So they are kind of oligopoly. Now, what does an oligopoly or a monopoly do? The monopoly is so strong that it can reduce supply at will. Okay, let's look at it in the bigger world picture. This doesn't happen a lot now, but in the 1970s, definitely this was very prevalent. there is a cartel or an oligopoly called OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, OPEC had countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Venezuela. Now, these countries, whenever they wanted, they could reduce the supply of oil. Likewise, in every country, there are markets where there are some large firms, some monopolies. Now, what those monopolies can do, they can reduce the supply at will. Now, when they reduce the supply, why do they do that? Because when the supply is reduced, prices go up, and when prices go up, these companies can make supernormal profits. But that is the objective of the government. The government is not interested in reducing supply. It is when if it is pursuing supply side policies, it wants to increase the supply. So when it wants to increase the supply, it's going to regulate a market. It's going to try to regulate means to impose regulations to break the power of the monopolies or the oligopolies. So it's entirely based on the objective. The objective here is to increase the supply. Likewise, what happens that in certain markets um, there is free competition. Now, government has to make sure that where there is free competition, where the market structure is competitive, okay, in those markets, government should not hinder competition by regulating those markets. So that is where our third point comes in. Our third point is related to deregulation. The government must not regulate, it must not interfere in markets which otherwise are competitive, and government intervention merely creates red tape and a situation where the competition is hindered. So competition is a very important thing. Um, Social programs, okay. Now, according to the new right, or the new right movement, or Reaganomics, or the supply side, uh, social programs are a disincentive to work. For example, if you're giving unemployment benefits, so if you're giving unemployment benefits, what you are doing is you are giving people an incentive not to work, and that is not something that the supply siders are interested in, because if people don't work, then what will happen? The aggregate supply curve will shift backward. Aggregate supply will not increase. Okay. Another very important thing in supply side, and especially in economics, is very high expenditure on defense. All right. The United States currently spends about, the last I checked was about 500 billion US dollars, 500 billion US dollars on defense. All right. And since the time of George Bush, they have been saying that they are underspending. They want to raise it above $1 trillion. I'm not really sure what the figure right now is, but the last I checked was. So they are saying that right now we are spending a third of what we ought to be spending. So a very high level of expenditure on the military, on the military industry. Because please try and understand, if the military orders hardware, if the military orders planes, military orders ships, okay, those ships will have to be built, those planes will have to be constructed, and it will take a lot of people to build that infrastructure, or build those machines, or build those vehicles for the army, and that is going to create a lot of employment in the country. So that is also related to. There are other things that the government also does. The government every government cannot afford to increase defense expenditure. So one thing that the government can do is it can develop the human capital in the country. Very important. Now, this is one thing that we in the country are not doing. The reason why the underdeveloped countries are underdeveloped is that their human capital is not developed at all. When we talk about human development, we are talking about giving new skills to the workers through intensive training programs. it's not just about education in the sense of providing them a degree. They have to be able to apply what they are learning in the marketplace. Of course, the education is also important, because unless and until people know the difference between doing right and doing wrong, they will not be able to. Then other problems will arise in the economy. But nonetheless, people should have the technical knowledge to. They should be trained enough to do work so that they can contribute to the output of the country and thereby increase the supply of the country. Okay. Another thing that the government can do is it can reduce tariffs on imports of those material, imports of those material which are required for increasing production in the country. So you want to increase the supply. So you can reduce tariff on machines that can be used in the production process. Okay. So, but what will be the problem here? The problem is that please keep in mind this is more like political as well. Okay. So um, when you decrease social service programs, for example, what happens is people who depend on social services, they will not like this idea. But um, the supply side, of course, is a very attractive way of trying to manage the economy. I will once again go over the salient policy tools that the government has when it's pursuing supply side policies. The government has number one, indirect taxation. The government can reduce taxes. Okay. Why does it reduce taxes? It reduces taxes because it wants the individuals to have more money to spend, and for them to feel that they are enjoying the rewards of their sorry rewards of their labor. Then deregulating the market where competition exists, regulating the market where competition does not exist, reducing tariffs on imports, okay, which are used in manufacturing, not for consumption. Okay. Then there is development of human capital, and then of course this they can also, what they can also do is they can institute policies to attract local and foreign investment. And please, it goes in that order. You will have to institute policies to encourage your own savers to invest in the country. All right. If you cannot encourage people, your own compatriots, your own countrymen, to invest in the country, how can you encourage foreigners to invest in the country? So when they invest in the country, they invest in uh, long-term assets, they invest in machines, they invest in um, they will invest in industry, and that is going to lead to more employment and more output, and the supply curve, aggregate supply curve, is going to shift outward. Okay. And then one final thing that the government does is, and it's really um, interesting, and this is something that that happened in England. um, it happened in England in 1990, that the government tried very hard. The British government tried very hard, though they were not overtly following any supply side policies. But the one thing that they did was in England was they tried to break the power of the unions. So that is another very important aspect of supply side. In supply side policies, government will try to break the power of the labor unions. Why would the government want to do that? Because labor unions are those uh, organizations that try to negotiate wage increases for the workers. Now, when they are trying to negotiate wage increases for the workers, what's going to happen? The cost of production for the uh, the cost of production for the producer will go up. And when the cost of production goes up, once again, the supply will fall and the aggregate supply curve will shift backward. Once the aggregate supply curve shifts backward, there is a shortage, the GDP is reduced and the prices increase, and then there is inflation. All right. So this is about it as far as um, supply side is concerned. And hopefully, inshallah, we will now go to the next topic. All right. Okay. Thank you very much.